Herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Ausgabe des Videopodcasts von Ikonen, dem Kulturmagazin. Heute habe ich einen ganz besonderen Gast bei mir, nämlich Luna Duran, eine Körperkünstlerin und professionelle Bodypiercerin aus Berlin. Das Gespräch wird auf Englisch stattfinden und wer sich über sie kundig machen möchte, kann sie auf Instagram und im Internet finden. Auf Instagram unter Book of Luna und im Internet bei der Webseite lunaduran.com. Viel Freude. Welcome, Luna. Great to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I was very fascinated when we first met to hear that actually from South America and to be correct, from Bolivia. So you have a very special background. I'm very curious. Can you tell us something about your origin story? Where do you come from, the background, and how did it bring you here where we are now? A little bit, not the whole story, but probably the important things.
So legend has it that my mother wanted to have a child, and she visited Virgen de Quillacollo, which used to be a moon altar in pre-Hispanic times, and prayed to this altar for a daughter, and I was born in the Andean parts of what is now known as Bolivia. And I grew up basically by mountains and in a very traditional household. My grandmother spoke Quechua. And so she was very tied to like old traditions. And in the way that I grew up, I always saw magic in everything. And I was very tied to nature and exploring and learning and observing. So this initiated a lot of my practices, but the political situation in Bolivia isn't such that there's many opportunities for people. My mother very courageously decided to migrate to the United States when I was about 4 years old. And I lived there and grew up there, was educated there. I say indoctrinated there. Until I was able to leave my house and studied art and philosophy and photography in Richmond, Virginia for some time before moving out to California and really pursuing the body piercing career. And very shortly thereafter came to Berlin and I kind of just continued doing the thing here. But Bolivia is always like the first reference for me in everything that I do, in especially in terms of what I consider ritual and spirituality and things like that.
So it's kind of your cultural identity is drawn from your upbringing there.
Yeah, I think that it's really especially growing up in La Paz and because La Paz is such an interesting like influx or like meeting place of so many different things. The political reality is very alive and very like in your face, always at the forefront of pretty much everything you do. Like from one day to the next, the La Paz can be covered in protests, thousands of people. And then there's this like very like almost like dark aspect of La Paz that is tied to like colonialism and the survival of traditions being demonized in old times, and people sort of embracing that they were demonized and then deciding that it is witchcraft and we're fine with that and we practice witchcraft and fuck you, we're still going to church. So there's also this like very shrewd pride in tradition in La Paz, which gets sort of like manipulated by political parties sometimes. But for someone like me, obviously I'm very interested in the darker aspects of art and especially my body art practice. I love like exploring very esoteric stuff about it and making my own way. And I've always been probably like you, very attracted to like dark arts and things like that. La Paz just lends itself to being a very mysterious, very like magical, surrealist landscape for being able to understand a part of my identity that would have otherwise, I think, been had I stayed in Bolivia, I would have been so tired of it, and probably ashamed of it, because internalized colonialism is a real thing, to where I wouldn't have explored it artistically or in a way that I could integrate it into the work that I do. So, yeah, La Paz is a very dark place. You can ask Pablo about that too. He has a kind of a similar opinion to me, and the two of us are like the Bolivian darks of Berlin, you know?
That's interesting. Yeah. I only have some very vague impressions from South American places. I've been to Chile, and especially I've been to Colombia, to Bogota, and there we traveled to an orchid forest. So I have an idea how this kind of South American jungle surrounding can affect your psychology, and that's very interesting, because for me, I've been interested in shamanistic practices and contexts for many for a long time, and I also studied cultural anthropology for that reason, especially. But my impression is that there is a certain idea of which could be called shamanism in what you just told, isn't it?
Yeah. If you take on this very modern interpretation of these practices that sort of like clumps everything under the umbrella term of shamanism,
Yeah.
yes, people believe that they are speaking to spirits,
Hmm.
and in altered states of consciousness, and that these spirits are around us in order to make dealings with and ask for things and things like that. So in that way, yes, shamanistic for sure. My experience of it, uh, so body art and pretty much a lot of my theoretical way of thinking about what I do is also a practice of decolonization, because I feel that the religious traditions were interrupted in terms of their evolution by the invasion of the Spanish, and so for me, using terms that don't come from the tradition, I just don't do that. So in the Andes, for example, there are amautas, sages, and there are yatiris, and there are curanderas, and curanderas, I think, could be seen also as a response to colonialism, and but this animistic view that everything is imbued with spirit is very much alive still, and even the dead speak, and necromancy in the Andes, the way that it's understood in the West, it is a practice of necromancy, but it's also a practice of ancestor worship, and so I like talking about it in different terms, because it offers a challenge to my brain and how I think. But yeah, it does feel like a magical, surrealist sort of, if you're talking to the dead, um, that's not something that other people can see, but everyone in Bolivia does it.
I see. So there's a coexistence of the colonialized, Christianized aspects and the traditional aspects which you are talking about. And something which is obviously the case in Mexico as well, and in some other countries there. And so your techniques are taken from the heritage of the tradition you're talking about, and you're working with this, if I understand that correctly.
As much as possible,
Hmm.
because because these practices were interrupted, knowing exactly how they were practiced without the influence of the church is kind of impossible. So I do a lot of investigation into what these practices looked like in the past, and how they were documented, how people talked about it. But also my experience from when I was a child, it was through the lens of Catholicism, you know, a very deep sort of like shame of everything. And so like you talk to the curandera, you know, the bruja, but you didn't tell anyone. This is just a lady that you knew and your family knew, and you asked her some questions. Sometimes she read you your coca leaves. In my family, for example, we've had plenty of cleansings by this woman. I myself have had a relationship with her since I was 2 years old, and she takes me to mountain altars, and we do cleansings, but it's all through the lens of Catholicism. And so that I understand really well. My practice of what I do is actually looking at that and using like things that she tells me to then try to write about them. And in order to write, as you probably know, you have to spend your entire life researching and reading through articles, reading through books, and like, you know, and so I would say that most of my practice is actually this like reading compulsion that I have to find little clues in different books and how I want to put it together. And then you know, maybe I could see some syncretism in other mythologies in other parts of the world. Currently, I'm very, very into like Mesopotamian magic, and I do find a lot of similarities in some way, but I can't for sure say that those similarities could be seen as true back in that time. You know, this is my interpretation of how I'm reading things that were written by people who interpreted things of the past through whatever lens they wanted to interpret them through. So, and I like that. I can't claim that my way is true or traditional or anything other than, you know, just a really fascinating journey of research and research and research and then bleeding.
Yeah. So you see yourself as a spiritual seeker.
Absolutely.
And this is expanded onto your body. So, has there been a certain moment in your life that drew you to this, actually?
A couple that I can remember when I was a little girl. One of them was threading like needles through the top layer of my skin, which didn't hurt and didn't bleed, but it was just really interesting to play with that. And sometimes I would hurt myself and make myself bleed, and be like, okay, you know, just having this feeling of wonder of like, I wonder, you know, why this happens, or like blood is like cool looking. I always thought that blood, my blood in particular, has a very beautiful color. And so this is a very interesting thought to have since you were a child, and stays with me. And the second is accidentally, and I don't know how accidental. I mean, the way that I remember the story is that it was accidental. I stapled my fingers together in class, and kids were like freaking out because there was blood, and they're like, oh my God. And I was like, yeah, it's just this, and it's not a big deal. But they would freak out, and I was like, oh, okay. So you're supposed to freak out, but it's really not that big a deal. But then I would be sent to the office, and, you know, they would have to talk to me. And it was just like such a big deal that I was bleeding in front of people. And I knew that anytime that I wanted to go home and not go to class anymore, I just had to staple my fingers together, scare the kids, and then, you know, get out of there. So that was also like a formative moment for me that I recall, just being like, oh, this isn't a big deal at all. I had like a really intense fear of not needles or anything like that, but like injections. And I remember thinking that that's something that I don't want to have, like that fear. And so this idea of developing a tolerance, or like developing indifference to something like that, was also the beginning of my practice. The older I got, I started with a needle, started carving words into my skin very, very, very slowly and very meticulously, just in private, not telling anybody. And there weren't words that were like horrible. I was never interested in self-harm or mutilation or hurting myself, punishing myself with this. I always thought that the words that I wrote onto my skin, I could somehow like absorb into me. So there would be words like honor. There would be words like love. They would be like pacts that I made with my best friends. And so for me, I never had this idea that I was punishing myself by doing this. It was a practice of overcoming a fear and a practice of like absorbing significance and self-identity creation, right? I didn't see it that way at the time, but now when I look back at it, I'm like, oh yeah, of course that's what it is, because that's what I still do, like and so after a while, like this was in private, and I knew I was going to be an artist somehow. And I knew that my art could not be easy. I wanted to say very profound things with my art. And it just so happened that I found a lot of profundity in, things that aren't beautiful superficially, or they could be a very difficult kind of beauty, not something immediately pleasant, like pink and just like bodacious babes with big, like I knew it was going to be difficult. I discovered Joel Peter Witkin, the photographer, and at the time I knew I wanted to be a photographer, and he had this photo in one of his books, I believe, called The Mandan, and it was a photo of Fakir Mushafar with two hooks in his chest, just hanging.
I know that, yeah, for sure.
And when I saw that, like, that opened this idea in me, because I was like, that person definitely doesn't give a fuck about pain. That person is in peace. And I think I know what that feels like. I think I've felt that before, but this must be at another level. And I want to get to that level. I need to suspend. And I was like 15 years old at this time. And I knew that I was going to suspend. And it would take me about another 12 years or so to actually do it. But I couldn't quite consider it spirituality at that time, because I believed myself to be an atheist. And, I constantly have arguments with the atheist side of me in everything that I do. But I kind of understood that there was something really profound happening. There was this experience happening with this body that was taking this mind somewhere else. And I want that. And I think that that's what I needed to do. And doing research, this was at the beginning of the internet, and there was a BME zine, which was like the first social media network in existence. And that I found while researching Fakir Musafar. And there was all these people who were not just piercing themselves and cutting themselves, but they were doing this to wear jewelry in parts of your body that I was like, you can do that? And that's where the whole idea of like, I can make a living being a body piercer began. And that became the other goal that would feed, the opportunity to suspend and lead this like crazy life that seemed deep for me, or I felt like I could explore all the things that interest me by way of the body in that way.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking about the late 90s now, or is it earlier?
Wow. So 15, I would have been like 92, 93, something like that.
Oh, okay. Also, so
no, later. 95, okay. 97. Yeah.
Mid-90s. Okay.
Yeah, mid-90s.
Because you said this about the internet, and that's a very interesting thing, because I grew up, my whole youth was without the internet. So what I was inspired by was different things. It was fanzines from the subcultures, like punk and gothic and industrial subculture. And then I watched music videos, and the first time I saw the Sundance Ritual, like the hook hanging suspension, was in a music video by Fields of the Nephilim in the Psychonaut video. So this was in 1989. And I saw this on Music TV. And so it's an interesting thing that it's probably even some years make a difference in generational experience there. And then I started researching these things as well, but I had to go to the university library of cultural anthropology to find out about body techniques and ritual body techniques of the other cultures. And this was the one thing. And then it was possible to exchange tapes of like such rituals and documentaries on body techniques as well. But it always had this idea, I have to know what I'm searching for. And I have to find someone who knows more than me. It was really hard to research at that time, I can tell you. And so it wasn't as fast as it could be at the moment because everything seems to be available. You said you needed some more 12 years to actually do it, which means you had to prepare for that, obviously. You had to come of age in a way to deal with it. But we had to just, at that time, even body piercing was not that usual. And especially when you wanted to have some like a nipple piercing, that was not usual, especially as kind of a German guy who was thinking about, why not do a nipple piercing? And so it was really expensive to get this done in a tattoo shop where they also did piercing, several hundred euros probably at that time back then. Yeah, the jewelry was expensive because it was imported back then. And then most of the time they were giving anesthetics. So this was an additional cost factor. The thing is that I tended to, because I was not rich at that moment, I was a student, and I decided to do this privately. And I knew a guy who actually had experience doing this for like 1 or 2 years, but it was totally amateur, total. And you have to, I mean, you know more than me what I'm talking about. And he had all this equipment to do it. And I visited him then. And he said, okay, better you lie down. And I said, oh, why lie down? And yeah, but you could pass out. It's really hurting a lot because I want to have the nipple pierced. And I said, okay, but you don't do anything to anesthetics and stuff like. No, I'm not allowed to do that actually, and so we have to do it like that. And I was like, okay, I can't back out now. And so I lay down, and it was really one of those harsh experiences. I mean, it's different for everyone, and I know people who have different experiences with nipple piercing. And for me, I was close to passing out because it hurt so much.
My
And
gosh.
yeah, probably because he was like
Really
it's
pushing,
yeah,
probably.
it was really like the what's it called? The tissue is really hard at that place. And yeah.
Actually, let me give you like a little bit of information that I
Yeah,
know
yeah,
about the German sort of like body piercing scene, probably before then also. But what they used to do is they used to get veterinary needles
yeah.
and use them and reuse them. So one of the reasons why it was so difficult to go through skin like that was because the needles were just very dull. Autoclaving didn't really start, like real sterilization processes didn't really start in Germany until Tattoo Sammy and Michael Kors, or not, Manfred Kors brought autoclaves into some of the conferences at the time, teaching and tattooing and stuff like that. I can send you some pictures and stuff like that to just give you a little bit of insight into why these things were so painful back in that time.
Yeah, it also depends if you go through the nipple or behind the nipple.
The areola, yeah.
And so all these things. I mean, I was never really happy with this piercing actually because it never really healed. It was like an amphoter's wound for years, and then I removed it actually, and I
Oh,
still have the
good.
scars. I was really happy with my labret piercing here, which I don't have anymore, but I really regret removing that actually.
Let's put it
Uh,
back.
yeah, we can. I have the beard now. You
Just
won't
shave.
see it anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
So the thing is, it's a difficult thing if you work in academics, because people will always say, yeah, they are not allowed to judge you from these things, but you have definitely problems when you go too far in the eyes of some of those people and you apply for a position, and then they tell you, yeah, you're a bad example probably, and stuff like that, and it's not really serious, and you have to be boring. You're not boring enough. So the thing is, I was experimenting during my studies, and I studied for a long time, like 18 semesters or something like that, which is not possible today, unfortunately, because it was really a bliss to do that at that time. Like the whole 90s, I was busy studying and experimenting. And I went to the Torture Garden in London regularly from 1991. So it was founded in 90. And this was a huge initiation for me, because I was already into some fetish elements, experimenting with leather and uniform elements and stuff like that. But then I was had an undercut, and later I had black dreadlocks and stuff like that, and which I did not interpret as dreadlocks. So the new discussion is also a thing I will go about in my book on body politics in 2024. Anyway, but so this was a very important moment for me to see actually people who are much further than myself, and to follow these ideas. Do you remember this kind of subcultural initiation? For what was that moment for you when you got in contact with other people actually doing that?
I started my first apprenticeship in 2007 for body piercing when I lived in Virginia. But like the subculture that I was most attached to was like the metal scene in South America and North America. And body piercing wasn't really like very much a part of it, other than people kind of had it. So I didn't really, for a long time, I think I didn't really explore that too much, other than privately. But then once I initiated my apprenticeship, that gave me the confidence to start meeting other people that I could potentially learn from. And again, went into BME zine and started posting pictures of the work and the work that I was getting done on myself. Um, Meeting people, having conversations. I've always been a very opinionated big mouth, and so I think that draws some attention in a way. I really like writing about all of these things, and through that I got a scholarship to attend the Association of Professional Piercers conference in Las Vegas in 2011. And the really interesting part in the way that things work was that Alan Faulkner, who was apprenticed to Fakir Mushrafar, and is considered sort of like the catalyst for the modern practice of hook suspension, he reached out to me, and he has always been at that time was very involved in teaching and also performance with suspension. He reached out to me because he knew I was a scholar, and was like, would you like to take a cab with me from the airport to the hotel? And I was like, oh my gosh, Alan Faulkner reached out to me. And for me that was like, yes. And started talking to him, and I have to say that was a really incredible opportunity, because Alan Faulkner knew everybody, and he really took the time to introduce me to everyone, who was like a big deal in the scene. And then I knew that I was going to suspend. I had a really horrible car accident in 2010 also, which gave me more of a motivation to really pursue This because that was a very intense experience with my body, and I wanted to reclaim whatever agency I could. I couldn't walk for several months. I lost my sense of smell for a year. So that was a very traumatic body thing, ordeal. And so when I met Alan Faulkner, and I was in the Association of Professional Piercers conference, I was very motivated to really pursue this really more deep connection with my body, and pushing that. I had reached a limit. I had to be resuscitated. I call it, my first death, that accident.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the people that Alan Faulkner introduced me to was Fakir Mushafar. And I consider Fakir Mushafar the father of modern body suspension. Him and Stellark are some of the touchstones of the culture. And of course, it's not an easy conversation to have because it is problematic. And we can, of course, talk about that. But at that point, meeting Fakir Mushafar was full circle for me. And that would become one of the most important relationships of my life.
That's very interesting. I saw a picture with you and him, so I was going to ask about this for sure. And I knew him as a personality, but never saw him in person or something, just in films. And I read about him. There's the Modern Primitives book where he's interviewed a lot, and a book from the 80s, interestingly, because there has been an awareness of these things. But as I said, it was very focused on certain people and a certain points of research, and you had to find an axis, and then it worked, but it took a long time to find that axis. It's very interesting that you're talking about this accident. I was not sure if it was appropriate to ask you about this, because I read that you actually wrote something on Facebook, I think, about this.
Maybe my blog and Facebook, and
yeah, your blog, and it was shared on Facebook. And so the interesting thing is that I tried to remember what experiences I had, because fortunately I never had such a hefty accident. But as a child, like 5 years old, I had this experience of when my asthma began. So I have allergic asthma, but at that time it was not clear, and I was yeah, I was struggling at that moment, and that the doctors had to be called, and I was got then an injection and stuff. It's something that some people might experience as a child, but it's for me it was like a fear, the first fear of death, like fear of dying at that moment. And so I never forgot that, especially the feeling of something forcing the air out of you, and then fixing you there, and this strange kind of stasis. And later, when I grew up, I always had this fantasy about being held captive and being closed in physically. And so to work with this fantasy, with this recurring fantasy, I developed certain fetishes, actually. And one of these was during the 90s, I was really keen on wearing a leather corset, actually, which is not that usual with men, actually, but it was like this hard leather corset, which gave me that kind of feeling of this being closed in, encapsulated in a way. And so also heavy leather has this idea of a shell, not a second skin, but a second shell probably around your body, and so on. So all these things probably are connected to this very early childhood experience. But this is something which came later to my mind. I was never in the impression that I have to deal with that in that way. It's just an interpretation of myself, probably. But that reminded me of that. So probably there has to be a certain incidences that bring you further into the idea of wanting to expand the borders of the body. in the way you also described that.
I think kids are
Yeah.
very, very good at identifying those limits. Aside from the practice of like cutting myself and piercing myself, I also had this practice of making my friends pass out and my friends making me pass out.
Like
And
holding them very close.
it's called a blood choke, and it's absolutely is something that nobody should ever do at all, in
Yeah.
my professional opinion. But this was also something that attracted me to martial arts,
Oh
and
yeah, yeah. It's like this technique where you
submissions.
stop the blood flowing.
Yeah, and you just kind of gently go into the ether and then come back sort of disoriented, because there's a lack of blood flowing to your head, and this feeling of going away and coming back, as you're describing being encapsulated, it reminds me very much of that, of like everything kind of like closing in around you and then coming back. That for me, the second before I come back entirely, I'm in this liminal space of being here nor there. And the things that my mind goes to at those moments are really fascinating to me because I have no control over them. Does that happen to you also, when you feel encapsulated by maybe corseting or things like that?
Yeah, it changes the perception of reality in a way, and in a very subtle way, very subtle. Not in this like wow, like in a drug-induced way or something like that. And I've never been really into drug using, I have to
Yeah.
say, because probably I'm so caring for my mind because I'm working with my mind all the day. I cannot risk anything. It's like a fear more
Yeah.
that keeps me away from
It's
drugs.
very real. Yeah.
Okay. Good to hear that. So there
I'm
are
the
other
same
people
way.
who
Yeah.
say, "Ah, you have to do it."
Yeah, I have a lot of people offer like ayahuasca or
Yeah,
some
things
sort
like
of
that. Yeah.
psychedelic. Yeah, and they um tell me it's like the most amazing spiritual experience I've
Mm.
ever had. But then the way that they enact in the world doesn't show too much of a difference to me.
Okay.
So I'm sure that they've had really amazing spiritual experiences on drugs, but I think that the spiritual path is like a really slow process that you can get to that understanding, and that spiritual realization in a slower way. For me, the hook suspension, the way that I practice it, helps me get to a lot of the same spiritual realizations that I've had when I did acid and peyote and things like that. And I don't discount it at all, but I just think it's be very careful of um, quickly attained wisdom that maybe you need to actually integrate into your body first before you truly understand it, and that way enact it in the world through your body, with your values. I'm also not really interested in drugs, to be honest, which, being in Berlin is quite the feat.
I know. Yeah. But
Yeah.
let's talk about the suspension itself, the technique of suspension. I've seen photos of you hanging on hooks through the muscles of your upper chest. That correct?
Well, hooks should not go through muscles.
Okay. The skin.
We separate the skin from the muscles to really. I'm sure I know that I've had hooks through a muscle before, and that caused and I can show you one day, that caused some nerve damage
Oh God, yeah.
also. Um, but the actual hook itself goes to under skin. I mean, if you go through like cheeks and lips, you're going through muscle, but like here, it's skin under my breasts, for example. It's also very loose skin. I feel like this is my favorite area to suspend from because I have like really loose tissue, and it's a really intense piercing, which I like the challenge of that, but also the quickest way for me to go into outer space.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So there's also the possibility to put hooks through your back and
Yes.
through the flesh of the legs or arms, for example. I've seen all of this in piercing rituals and so on. So your favorite position is the chest suspension.
Yeah, chest and torso. Like this general area is my favorite, and it's really really difficult to do. For me, the I can suspend from my back, you know, very very well, and I can't say it's easy. I would never suggest that this is easy, but I'm fairly confident in my ability to just go into that very very gently, and I can immediately leave the ground on cue, and I do that for performance, and it's fun. It's you know, I can dance on hooks going through my back, you know, in the scruff of my back, really. If you can imagine picking up a cat from the scruff.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
pretty
That's
much the
what it
same.
looks like, actually, because
Yeah, that's what
the
it is.
skin stretches a lot. You wouldn't imagine if you don't know that.
Right, and you definitely feel the stretch, and the skin definitely detaches itself from your body in a way, because when you come down, you're gonna notice that there's like pockets of air under your skin that you have to
Okay.
push out. So the body horror aspect of suspension is also something that I don't downplay for people. Like,
Yeah.
I understand that it's difficult to see, and that difficulty for me is an opportunity to practice what I call extreme empathy with people. If you're going to witness me suspending or witness somebody suspending, I think that you immediately are experiencing that with that person. You understand that I'm in pain. Your body's going to tell you that person is feeling pain, and most often I get the reaction from people that they feel like protecting me, and that they feel like caring for me when they see that. And to me, that's really insightful into the power of this as an image, right? The image of me suspending evokes a feeling of caring from total strangers, you know.
Mm.
And I like that, and it gives me something other than like the accusation of mutilation and self-harm and things like that. And this is what I base my practice of body piercing in, like this extreme empathy and self-ownership.
Yeah. So when you do this several times, I can imagine that there is a scar tunnel under the skin left in a way. Is that true, or is it just growing back and disappearing over time?
There is definitely some scar tissue um, as the hook holes are healing, but they tend to become more stable and softer over time. And I also do things to my body to minimize how much scar tissue I am cultivating through hook suspension. And I do this because I have the practice of cultivating scar for body art
Yeah.
without ink. And so it's also my way of experimenting with, you know, the scar production of skin, and using skin as different types of art. So for me, hook suspension is not really intended to make scar, so I minimize that scar as much as possible.
Mm.
You'll still see some like pigmentation from where the hook holes were recently, but suspensions that I've done like maybe 5-6 years ago, it's very very difficult to tell that I've done them by the presence of their scar. But when I want to develop scar, I can, and my body can scar really well for that too.
So your back is, as I've seen on pictures, really covered with scarification artworks. Is that
Yes.
okay? Correct.
And now my arms too.
Mm-hmm.
And in the future, I have a lot planned for that. So
Okay.
it's going to be a lot more than what is visible now.
So I have a lot of huge tattoo stuff on the back, for example, which is also really like there are certain areas of the back which really hurt a lot when you tangle them. Probably you will agree on that as well, because in close to the neck, for example, or on the chest, on the center of the chest, for example. Um, but how would you compare getting, because I don't have scarification, how would you compare the pain of being tattooed with the pain of being scarified?
Scarred,
Scarred.
for cut. Yeah, like so I definitely don't advocate for the size of scarification that I have had, because that took 14 hours to complete, and it was done by Jan Brynjak, who passed away a couple of years ago. And that was a very, 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 very difficult piece to create for the two of us. For him, because it's a feat of physicality to work on a body for that long. And for me, because at a certain point, I felt like I was being skinned alive. And it's not a pleasant feeling. I don't like pain. I think that sometimes people have this idea that like pain turns me on or something like that. And that's not the case. The pain itself isn't what turns me on. It's like what happens immediately after the pain, where I'm feeling like I'm in a state of in an altered state of consciousness. That is what turns me on in a sort of like being spiritually turned on kind of way, right? But the pain itself was horrible, and I really wouldn't suggest that for anyone. My experience with other people who use topical anesthetics for scarification was actually very pleasant, and that didn't hurt at all. And I don't use anesthetics for tattoos. So for me, tattoos are quite painful. The tattoo on my hand, for example, done by Edward in California, that was really painful. And now I look back at it and I feel really bad that I put Edward through that, because it was like hours of me just like, yeah. And you know, yeah, I
Was he
don't like the
moved by that?
sensation of tattoo, right? Yeah, I don't like the sensation of tattooing. Actually, for me, it's kind of like an annoying pain that only gets worse with time.
Yeah.
And I'm one of those people who are like, no, you have to earn your tattoos. So like, you can't use anesthetics, and don't trust me with that. Like, do whatever you want with your body. But like, just for me, you know, I don't do the anesthetics thing. And tattoos are not really my thing, to be honest. I'm not very tied to the culture of tattooing. I don't really particularly aesthetically like tattooing so much, because it's like image on a body, and for me, the body creates image with scar. So for me, it's kind of that's the distinction that I make in terms of what I like.
That makes total sense. But I would say tattoos for me are always a kind of signification of the body at a certain point in time, where I have a connection to a certain symbol, for example, that keeps in mind what I experienced there. So it is kind of a history of my life written in the body, or on the body, if you like. So it makes sense, but it's a means to have that. And I actually don't enjoy the process, but the result.
Yeah.
So it's very similar to what you described. It's because I'm always hesitant to talk about this, because there are tattoos who don't hurt that much, but I have the experience of certain parts that hurt so much I will never forget that, and my body will for sure not forget this. So you're hesitant to tell this to people who really work with their body on the level that you do, because you feel like it's embarrassing in a way.
Oh gosh, like you know, that's one of the things that I really dislike about the body modification, body piercing, body tattooing scene, is that there's this idea that if you're stoic in the face of pain, that somehow you belong more, or
I
like
see.
it's praised in some way to be stoic in the face of pain.
Mhm.
That's definitely something that like I cultivated, the being able to be stoic when getting hurt, but I don't really value it that much. I would much rather be honest about my experience of it. Like, it's never easy, and I don't think that I would like it if it was easy, to be honest. If I was getting pierced and I didn't feel nervous in anticipation of the piercing, I wouldn't have anything to overcome, and it wouldn't do for me what I need for it to do. So like when there are so many hook suspension demonstrations that I see in tattoo conventions online, on YouTube and stuff like that, where it's just like people who are like, I love pain, it freaks and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, that's really alienating for other people who could potentially like try this if they didn't think that you had to be stoic in the face of pain. Like, I think that the message that I would much rather give with my work is like, yes, it'll hurt, but your pain is safe with me. And I will take care of you, and you go where you need to go. I'll hold down the anchor here. You do what you need to do out there. If that means cry, if that means yell, if that means feel the pain and tell me that it hurts, if that means to stop, it's safe. You don't need to impress anybody with this. You don't need to be perfectly fit to suspend. You don't need to wear heels and thongs to suspend. You don't need to see it as like a BDSM thing, and you don't need to fuck people after you get suspended. It's like, I wish that we were more open to having people from outside of the BDSM body piercing community approach us with the desire to maybe experience something outside of their reality, that they might somehow feel something stir in them when they see it. I want to welcome those people, even if I don't listen to the same music, or I don't wear the same outfits as them. You know what I mean? Like, this is for everybody. Hook suspension has been happening for the entire breadth of human experience. We know that because there are mythologies that speak about it, So I don't want to suggest that this is specifically for a particular group of people. I want it to be for more people to explore.
It's a good thing that we started talking about the spiritual backgrounds that you're coming from and your thinking comes from, because that makes clear your standpoint at that in this aspect. Because I totally agree to that. From the outside, most people would say, "Oh, she is into this extreme form of BDSM," and that's a very important thing to see how diverse this whole thing of dealing with a body in different than profane aspects can be. So the spiritual aspect, what we call, or I call it the shamanistic aspect of body techniques, is obviously something which stayed with you and which is in the core of this experience still.
In my culture, something like hook suspension, as far as I know, it didn't really exist. Body modification did, tattooing did, and I suspect scarification did also, because of looking at the archaeological evidence and things like that, and blood sacrifice, for sure. Images of hook suspension, not so much. The way that I sort of like bridge the gap between the spirituality that I inherited and the spirituality that I have now is because I didn't consider myself, or it didn't really interest me to know about my heritage until listening to Fakir Musafar talk about Native Americans in North America, and finding myself being reminded about ways of thinking that were different from, of course, Western capitalist US of A, and I think that Fakir, at a time where I felt like I needed to fit in the United States as an American girl as much as possible, I speak white.
Yeah, and very good English, obviously, yeah.
And then that was important for me because it was a matter of survival. Being an immigrant, a person of color, it carries its own physical reality, I would say. And so for me, Fakir being the one to point to Native American cultures and saying there is something of value, great value here in these practices that we don't really understand, but we share bodies and we share physical experiences with these people who think that this is a spiritual path. For me, that was it gave me permission to look at my ancestry in a much more inspiring way, rather than feeling ashamed of it, which is, an internalized form of colonization, that shame that you feel as an immigrant, to want to fit in to where you are now and be so far away from the savages of where you come from, right? So that's how I bridge that gap. And then with that, I also, it was really important for me to not use body art in a way that, just looked like everyone else. I wanted it to be unique to me, and also a way to reconnect with my ancestry. And so that's why the icon on my back is the Viracocha icon that appears in the Gateway of the Sun in Tiwanaku, because that's one of the oldest images that I remember of my culture, that like is imprinted in my brain, and probably a lot of people who come from Bolivia and La Paz. And so that for me, the exploring these images and icons and researching for them, because the research never ends. Different people say different things about it, and I'm try to be up to date on the topics that I'm interested in. I keep learning through them, and the image itself acquires different meaning, and that's also a way of being a walking piece of artwork. That's the Book of Luna, right? The because it's changing on my body, and it's being created with my body, and as I'm growing, as I'm thinking, it's a walking work of art.
Do you consider yourself a queer personality?
I think that in terms of what I'm super queer. I'm like so queer. I'm not even like recognized as being queer, like, and I'm not saying that I'm like, I was queer before queer was cool kind of thing, but the way that I understand queer is just not necessarily fitting into the status quo. I don't really pay too much attention to my sexual preferences. But if that is the card that allows me in the queer community, I'm asexual on the demisexual part of that spectrum. So it's really complicated to talk about how I see queerness, because for me, it's also a deconstruction of, cultural conditioning. And I mean, by queer, I mean, I'm deconstructing everything. I'm deconstructing gender roles that were conditioned into me. I'm deconstructing dualism that seeped its way into my way of seeing the world and my place in it. I'm deconstructing family. I'm deconstructing ideas of politics, nation states, borders. So, and that's, I think, the political work that I'm really interested in when I talk about like a post-colonial approach to body art and a post-colonial approach to performance. I think that is how I see myself as queer. Just deconstructing all binaries and all that.
I can totally relate to that. And I was asking that because there is, in the academic context, there is a very narrow definition of queer, really focusing on gender identities at the moment. And it is really hard to come from a background that was questioning all the things you mentioned, like everything, and deconstructing things in an active and ritualistic way. And I got used to that during the 90s and in all the clubs I visited, and from fetish to BDSM clubs to occult incidences and rituals and stuff. And for me, it was always a chance to challenge society, but also to expand the concepts of society. And I now have the impression that the discussion of this word, especially of the word queer, is so narrow that it excludes actually people like you or people like me who have been working on this for decades, and which is grotesque. I mean, I'm not really like hurt by this, but I'm like I don't understand what is going on there. And I see there is no dialogue possible because the discussion is so much focused on certain concepts, if you agree to this concept or not. And that's a duality in itself. And to overcome dualities, you cannot focus again on new plus and minus questions. So I think it's very important. That's just my position here, to keep alive this very widespread idea of a queer personality, of being of leading a queer life. In contrast to the aspects of society which are not able to change or bring something interesting forth. So that's my reason to ask you this, and probably you get the idea here.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I feel excluded from the queer spaces. I'm actually very involved in a lot of ways. In the body piercing community, we have queer sirs, we have non-binary practitioners. There are a growing number of people of color entering the industry, and I believe that the representation of all of that is important in the industry, and I don't feel excluded from it. I would actually say that I'm given quite a large platform to be able to express myself in these spaces, which I really appreciate, and you know, I'm really thankful for. But I do see what you mean about the conversation being limited to only being able to say certain things and not really being open to exploring things from different perspectives. And I don't think that has to do with queer theory or queer kids or being young or being 20 something. I think it has a lot to do with manipulation from the media. And MySpace, Instagram, all of these places that control the discourse have been manipulating people in so many ways. And one of the ways that I find most damaging is that a lot of conversation points and a lot of what is considered permissible to say becomes a prepackaged theory, a prepackaged opinion, a prepackaged, this is the right thing to say whenever this is asked. And you can't question that. And I think that's just a really dangerous thing for a discourse. And not because I don't see myself, I don't agree with a lot of these things, but I want to open the floor a little bit to evolve this kind of thought. And you know, I grew up in the 90s that gave me a really cynical view of everything. And you know, like a lot of my heroes killed themselves. So I don't know if I really inherited something good from that time, you know. And a lot of my immediate reactions to things I know were learned through you know, the celebrities that I kind of admired at the time. And I see a lot of that now too. Like there are influencers now who provide people their hot takes, and those hot takes get repeated and regurgitated without much thought. Much like sit down, think with what you just said, where it comes from, who's saying it. And also it tends to be very centered on a Western person, be it a straight, gay, any kind of Western person. The discourse is always centered about what white people can or can't do. And honestly, I'm just like tired of that. You know, like I don't want to tell white people what they can and can't do with their bodies. I want to talk about the things that are going to change the way that things are. I want to talk about how we're going to change the fucking system, how we're going to reach equity, how we're going to be able to like see more people represented. Like I live in Berlin, you know, like not a lot of people look like me here. And I could see that as like me being, you know, discriminated against and so on. I've I definitely have been discriminated against, but I'll tell you one thing, I'm not going to let people oppress me. And the best thing that for me to do, I think, is succeed in what I'm going to do. You want me to learn German? I'll learn German, sure. But I'm still going to do what the fuck I want to do, because I'm a person, and I was born on this planet, and I'm going to question stuff. And I don't like a lot of the narrative that doesn't get explored outside of this permissible sort of like arena.
That's the point.
Yeah.
And I think it's what I'm talking about mainly comes from my activity in the academic context, because the limitation is the academic discourse. And there we have, I agree. The media are also influencing that, but also there's an undercomplex way of thinking about these things by people who are not after experiencing it, but only after making a career in repeating certain ideas. And so it limits itself. They don't start exploring these things. And that's what I told you, that I was really happy to be able to study for such a long time, because it was such an important chance to fail in certain areas and begin again. And it was a time where I was actually able to, I will go for 1 or 2 weeks to London, and I will experiment something. And I will go to somewhere else, completely, somewhere else, to experience another culture, for example. I've been to the desert, for example, for 10 days to do water fasting, and which was a really out-of-body experience there in the Sinai Desert, and things like that. And I don't see that being possible or desirable at the moment within the context I'm working, actually. I only see that in a context where I'm out of this. And then meeting people like you, or in the context of the Occulture Conference or anything else happening actually in Berlin, but not much else in Germany, as you know by now, I think. And but it is there, and there's a chance, but it's not that many people, in my opinion. Not that many. There are
Yeah.
people.
I think also, at least in Berlin, for all its progressive, forward thinking, social democratic way of life, I don't think that there's actually much room for experimental culture. Like a culture, for example, for me, seemed like a really huge effort on the part of people just like really, really doing this, putting this together with like not so many resources that the state could afford something like that, and I'm not sure if a culture can really influence things that happen in Berlin, because just the marginalized community of people who see themselves out of the status quo are having a really difficult time just living here. They're being displaced.
Yeah.
One of this last culture, for example, in the last day, we had a really beautiful closing ceremony, which I just really loved, because it really brought this idea that all of us in this room were a community, and take with you the magic outside and enact it in the world, right? And that's really difficult to do when a lot of your community just has to move away from where you are, and there are no spaces to be able to practice this under a more communal kind of horizontal practice. I think that's really, really difficult to do anywhere. One of the things that I really liked about the 90s is that people were really motivated to write zines. And, so there was a lot of just writing that was happening outside of academia, that punks and people from subcultures were like really expressing themselves. I don't see that anymore. and where that exists online, maybe it exists on Instagram. It's such a disposable medium that it just gets overlooked, and it doesn't, it's not something that like you have to sit down with and practice with people. So like I don't really see how subcultures can survive in this in this way, other than like individually in a lot of ways. In places like Berlin, I a lot of times when I go to subcultural events, esoteric events, I look around and it's nobody looks like me. And that's fine. I don't mind that so much, but that does create a sense of like I'm an outsider even amongst the outsiders,
I can relate to that as well.
Right. And that's a difficult place to be in order to really create a community. And some people are culture vultures. The esoteric community has also been commodified in a way that it's become like a really easy to market. A lot of people are selling courses on how to be more
they make a business out of that, and that's not the idea. That's an interesting thing. I attended a conference, Cultures of Transgressions, in Paris some years ago, which was held by Jack Sargent. Jack Sargent is from Australia. He wrote a book, Death Tripping, A Cinema of Transgression, about Richard Kern and the underground films from New York in the 80s. And he is focusing on film, mainly film, underground film art as an extreme art, searching for transgression of taboos, and the philosophy of transgression, obviously, by Georges Bataille and so on. So this conference was meant to push the dialogue between different generations dealing with transgressive art. And the funny thing is that I was in the midst, being like late 40s at that point. And there was the youngest participant was about 22 probably, and the oldest was over 70. So we had really a broad range of diverse ideas of transgressive art. But the most problematic thing was that, again, what was considered by the youngest participant being transgressive was mainly gender transgression and gender fluidity. And all the things the old guys talked about, like sexuality and death, Thanateros, and all the Bataille things were considered, oh, that's like 80s. And I said, no, this is 20s to 60s more. And I realized there's not even the desire to explore these things for a very young generation. Because when I was like 18, 20, I was like really into this stuff and exploring the deepest and darkest places in myself and elsewhere and in other people. And so I realized some of this might be gone if at a conference, Cultures of Transgression, people are not really keen on transgression anymore.
Yeah, I'm not really too attached with anything. I try not to be attached to how this needs to survive in one way or another. I see a lot of like queer artists these days doing really interesting work, and I really enjoy listening to these ideas of transgressing gender and what that means, and also really exploring how damaging these gender roles have been historically. Like that's a really important conversation for me too. And I would say that at least the work that I'm doing now with my friend Lucas Valeto Solinski, who is Brazilian, gay. He works at the Schwilles Museum, also an exhibiting artist. When the two of us come together to do the work that we do, which involves piercing and hook suspension, now performance, we did a performance at a culture conference this past iteration. that was an exploration of gender, like non-binary gender topic, because the framework of that piece was rituals of the past, like I'm talking like 5,000 years ago, in different cultures where the priests of these particular goddesses, and I'm not going to name anything because, like I said, it's just a framework, not an exact replica of a ritual. The priests of that time would wear makeup and female clothing in order to get rid of these gender roles and explore a sort of like spiritual non-dualism of being a whole person, so female and male. This isn't a new conversation either, right? Because it has existed in a ritualized fashion for thousands and thousands of years. And I'm glad that the kids are pointing out like why are non-binary genders excluded from important roles that they used to carry back in in antiquity, because now we're seeing that was the truth.
Yeah.
In Native American cultures, hermaphroditic people had noble roles in spirituality.
Yeah, they were considered sacred.
Yeah, and so like yes, please let's talk about that. Let the kids do that. Thank you for opening my brain up to that dialogue within myself and questioning what being a woman means to me, because now I'm a woman. I was assigned female at birth. I take on that identity, and with teeth and all, the woman that I've come to, or the womanhood that I've come to understand, that I've come to embody, is not submissive, possessed by a man, providing free labor for the success of a man, being stuck to the body or being stuck to the home, or having to fulfill a sort of like sexual object kind of thing. Like it's the creative aspect of femininity, but also the very destructive aspect of femininity. And my goddesses speak of this. And thank you for like reminding me that gender norms must be questioned, analyzed, and wherever you fit into that, that's it's interesting to see that when we talk about like transgressive art and stuff like that, you have to also realize that since the 80s, a lot of this stuff started looking very much the same. I remember seeing my first hook suspension shows in the early 90s, and then in the late 2000s being like, I already saw this in like a ton of tattoo conventions. And that's my experience of a lot of performance art these days too. So I think that this is a new thing that people are dealing with artistically, theoretically, philosophically, and so on. And it's also in future generations going to be replaced by a different sort of questioning. And that's good. That's what youth needs to do.
Yeah,
anyway.
I was not talking about excluding that aspect. I was talking about the tradition and the history of this phrase or idea of transgression and how it changed. Actually, that was my observation.
I see. In your way of seeing, because I grew up in the United States. I don't know how this developed in Europe. What is your way of seeing how it developed?
I can just it's hard to say in a short way, but the main idea, going back to the Bataillean, Georges Bataille philosophy, is that an act of transgression is the moment where you get connected to the sacred and to the sacrosphere. And so it's a ritualized act dealing with mortality, probably with sexuality, and giving up a certain part of yourself to experience the sacred. What we were talking about before is very closely connected to this idea, in my opinion. But I think I can break it down what the problem might be. The connection to death and violence is going away. And for my generation, and I have to state that very clearly, death and violence is a very important idea within culture, a concept within culture, communication, and art. So I cannot imagine art without extreme violence or depictions of death and sexuality, also explicit sexuality, and so on. And I have the impression that this new approach is moving away from the darkest and the most destructive aspects to find something new. Okay, which I probably don't have a real connection with. But that's, I would see. I'm curious how this is, and it's just an observation there. But I try to put it in very clear words now. Probably you have an idea now what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I really like that you said death and violence, because I have a difficult time speaking of this aspect of my work too, because people are really afraid of having conversations that are difficult, being confronted by strong ideas. It's really difficult for people to witness the what some people would consider violence in the work that I do, because I inhabit this very lithe, small body, and I think that people also are living in a very interesting time in history where there's this idea of, now the end of the world is not a religious end of the world. It's not, it's now a very scientific fact that we're reaching the end of the world and this is the last generation. And so the idea of sacredness, the difference between the sacred and the profane, is something that I think the younger generation just has no real connection to, no real interest in, unless it's something that, they can manifest, the life that they want, or, they can do magic to change their life for the better. And it's always like this idea that, you have to get better at being who you are. And that's like a real brainwashing to me, because I don't consider my spirituality that way. Like my spirituality is more of like the acceptance of an observation of the fact of life and death. And I have to come to terms with the violence enacted on me by this world. And it's true. And that does get reflected in my art, because my art reflects my truth and how I experience things. I'm not trying to like become a better person, or like trying to become a billionaire or something like that. I'm just trying to figure out who I am beneath all of this cultural conditioning. And that's a very different way of approaching, magic, body modification, religion even. But I think that that's much more true to and coherent with the way that I've sort of developed it for myself. And maybe that's part of the why we feel so alienated, because it like the art, the whole like manifest your best life, or YOLO, unlimited growth myth that everybody lives in, is not really real. It's please get off of the computers and like sit in front of people and notice how like it's not easy being alive, and it's there are cataclysms happening every day. Millions of apocalypses happen. The world is ending for somebody this second. Somebody is dying, somebody's family has died, somebody's child has died. Like horrible things happen constantly. That's a part of the cycles of life, and to not talk about violence and death is to not see the whole thing.
It's a perfect closing statement. I will leave it. I will leave it as at that. And I thank you very much, Luna, that you were with me and with us. And I encourage people to explore your work even more and get a piercing in Berlin. And your website is lunaduran.com.
That's
And
right.
there you'll find the shop where you're working and and the Book of Luna concept and your artworks as well. So
I really need to update it, but yeah, that's where that's where
that's
it goes.
that's a perfect moment to do that now.
You're
People will
right.
flood the
Oh my
page.
gosh.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you so much. And it was really fascinating, interesting to talk about these things, and which are not easy to deal with, as we experienced. And
No, and I know that you and I disagree on a lot of things, so I appreciate the opportunity to really go into it and be open to that too, be having those difficult conversations. So thank you.
a pleasure. Okay, bye bye.
Bye bye.